siguro system niya kasi minsan pag-record mo, hindi ka
The reason I killed him was because he was a child molester.
But you didn't kill him.
Oh, sure.
And you intended to.
Oh, sure, yes. Well, if it's all right, I'd like to tell you where it started.
Go ahead.
All right, well, he was my bunkie, and I had found out that he was in prison for child molestation. Really bad case. So that night he was trying to justify why he did it, and I just told him to be quiet, and he would have to leave in the morning to find a new cell. But he continued to talk about it and try to justify it, so he was a little bit bigger than me, so I got down and I hit him in his face a few times, and when he fell, I wrapped a cord around his neck and I took his life.
They're saying Rodder.
Hello, Sheriff's Office! Police Department, Sheriff's Office!
What's up, boy? Same way we came in, don't touch nothing.
On November 26, 2016, Joel Guy Jr. brutally murdered his parents in Knoxville, Tennessee. Guy Jr. had a plan, and to be honest with you, it was absolutely disgusting. His parents were about to retire and cut off his financial support. If they were dead or went missing, he would receive a $500,000 life insurance policy. He stabbed his father 42 times and his mother 31. His plan was to frame his father for all of it. After stabbing his parents, Guy Jr. injured his hand and left the dissolved remains in the house to tend to his wounds. When he returned, he saw that the cops had discovered the bloody scene during a welfare check. They also found a backpack with detailed notes about the attacks. They found plastic bins with dissolved remains, severed hands, and even his mother's head in a pot. In October of 2020, he was convicted of both murders and sentenced to life in prison. This shocking and disturbing case serves as a chilling reminder of the evil that can lurk inside of a human mind.
If I told you your mother was in the courtroom here today, would that be the truth?
No, so.
That would not be the truth. Why is that? Because she's not in the courtroom?
No, so.
Okay. So your mother is not in this courtroom?
No, so.
Okay. And you're telling me that that is the truth? That your mother is not in the courtroom?
Yes, so.
Okay. Where is your mother?
Jail.
She's in jail.
That woman sitting right there between them, have you ever seen her before?
Yes, so.
Who is that?
My mother.
Now you recognize your mother?
Yes, so.
Hey, James. Hey, Jack.
Yes, so.
Give me your hand. All right. Here. Here.
We finally have Bryan Kohberger's alibi, and I think it's weak at best. On the night that Kaylee, Maddie, Ethan, and Xana were stabbed to death, Kohberger claims he was driving around alone. That's it. That's the alibi. According to his lawyers, Bryan frequently took late-night drives by himself, and that is where he was in the wee hours of November 13th at the time of the murders. Now, a couple key points here. His lawyers specifically say that he can't say with certainty where he was, just where he wasn't. There aren't any corroborating witnesses either, and anyone who might be called to the stand to back this theory, they say, will be expert witnesses, so not someone who saw him or was with him. Remember, there are cell phone tower pings and plenty of CCTV footage from that night that tracks Kohberger from his apartment at 2:44 a.m. to after 5 a.m., traveling all around Washington and Idaho, including near the crime scene. It appears Kohberger's team is going to say those pings and that footage was simply taken from him on a joyride. Not sure how they're going to explain away why his phone was off for several hours of that trip and then suddenly appeared again when he was down dark farm roads, but however they explain it, I hope it's enough to acquit him in the fall of quadruple homicide. A Japanese teenager was brutally tortured and gang raped for 44 days before her body was dumped in a drum of wet concrete. On November 25th in 1988, 17-year-old Junko Furuta was biking home from a waitressing shift in Tokyo when 18-year-old Nobuharu Minato kicked her off her bike out of the blue and ran away. A 16-year-old named Hiroshi Miyano came to her aid and offered to walk her home. Little did she know this was a trap. Hiroshi ended up attacking Junko, raping her twice before calling that first guy, Minato, back, and then 2 other friends came who persuaded him to keep her in captivity. Here is when those 44 days of brutality would begin, and a trigger warning here, things are really about to get graphic. They held her in an empty house belonging to Nobuharu's parents, and there the boys would regularly gang rape her, torture her, and beat her. And not just the 4 of them, the teens invited other men back to the house with the express purpose of assaulting her. According to their own statements, they would force Junko to smoke and consume large amounts of alcohol. Then they would do things like douse her in lighter fluid and burn her, sodomize her, and starve her. She became so malnourished that she couldn't walk, and her burns and cuts were so infected that she became confined to the floor. Her poor little face was mangled to the point where you couldn't discern her features anymore. And while she was still alive, her body reportedly started to rot. On the 44th day, Hiroshi was in a foul mood because he lost a board game and he took it out on Junko. He doused her in lighter fluid and ignited it, and this is not the worst part. Over the next 2 hours, the boys excessively beat her. They made her drink her own urine. She was having convulsions. They repeatedly dropped an iron exercise ball on top of her until she succumbed to her injuries. They then wrapped Junko's mutilated body in blankets, shoved it in a travel bag, and then put that inside of a 55-gallon drum, which they then filled with concrete. They also threw in a videotape of the last episode of her favorite show because she said she had never gotten to watch it and they didn't want her to haunt them. The boys got caught, and after a police interview, cops found Junko's body inside that drum and were able to identify her through her fingerprints. Hiroshi only got 20 years in jail, 2 of the others a minimum of 5, and the last guy just 8 years in juvie.
I bet you didn't know the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based off true events. I am Bubba Sawyer, but you may know me as Leatherface. I was born into a deranged family of cannibals and sadistic killers living in a remote Texas farmhouse. My mother was a quiet woman, but my father was a monster. He was an abusive alcoholic who would beat my mother and us kids whenever he got the chance. As a child, I was always fascinated with the animals that my father would bring home to slaughter. I would watch as he killed them, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the beginning of my descent into madness. One day, my father brought home a chainsaw. It was a massive tool, and I was in awe of it. I begged my father to let me use it, and he eventually gave in. From that moment on, I was hooked. I would spend hours on end, cutting through trees and anything else that I could find. The sound of the chainsaw was like music to my ears. It was my escape from the reality of my life. But it wasn't until my father died that I truly lost my mind. I inherited his house, and I turned it into my own personal slaughterhouse. I would lure people in and kill them using my trusty chainsaw to do the deed. The screams of my victims were like a symphony to me. One day, a man named Kirk entered my home to barter for gas. I attacked him with a hammer, killing him. A woman named Pam came in after him. She found my living room strewn with human and animal bones. I grabbed her, impaled her on a meat hook, and dismembered Kirk's body with my chainsaw as Pam watched. Jerry came looking for them both. He found Pam's nearly dead, spasming body in a chest freezer. I killed him with a hammer. Later that night, I ambushed their 2 surviving friends, Sally and Franklin. I killed Franklin with my chainsaw. I captured Sally and brought her back to the house. We tried to include Grandpa in murdering her with a hammer, but Grandpa's grip was weak, and he kept dropping the hammer repeatedly. Sally broke free and ran onto our road in front of our house, pursued by my family. The truck driver attacks me with a large wrench, injuring me, and escaped on foot. Sally, covered in blood, flags down a passing pickup truck and climbs into the bed, narrowly escaping me. I was so angry I let her get away. My family won't be happy about this.
Most people have seen the movie Scream, and if you haven't seen it, you've at least heard of it or would at least recognize the iconic Scream mask. But not everybody knows that that movie was based on real murders. Welcome back for more spooky facts. I'm going to be spending the whole month of October doing scary stories and spooky history. This actually surprises a lot of people because Scream has a lot of humor to it, and it really subverts the typical horror movie, or at least it did when it first came out. It's now over 20 years old, where it wasn't just about like sheer terror. There was also funny moments, even in like the macabre horror of it all. Like quotes saying like, "I'm gonna gut you like a fish," and like the calls coming from inside the house, you know, things like that. People really clung to it. It had a lot of cultural significance at the time. But the actual murders that inspired the story are incredibly gruesome and truly terrifying. And so when the writers were exposed to the story in the news, they couldn't help but feel that it was incredibly cinematic. And so before they even applied the comedic undertones to the script, they knew that this narrative was incredibly motivating. On August 25th, 1990, the first murder occurred. The victims were two women named Sonja Larson and Christine Powell. On Saturday, the victim was Krista Hoyt, and on Monday, it was two roommates, Tracy Pauls and Manny Tabata. Trigger warning before I say this next part, because the bodies were mutilated, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly, but you might not want to hear that. All of the bodies were mutilated in some way, shape, or form, and a knife was used every single time, never a gun, never any other weapon. But Hoyt's body was the most notable mutilation. She was sort of propped up on her bed, like bent over, and her areolas had been sliced off. She had also been decapitated, and her head had been placed on a shelf next to the bed. Obviously, the gruesome nature of these murders and the quick succession with which it was escalating created a sort of outright panic in Florida. Students at Florida University were reportedly sleeping with weapons in their dorm rooms or under their pillows, out of fear that they would be the next victim. The mass panic that sort of ensued at the university makes a lot of sense when you consider that it was fall. A lot of these kids are leaving their parents' homes for the first time in their lives to live somewhere else, and 4 of the victims were actually students from the university. Something that all of the victims had in common was they were living off campus, but they were living in sort of like lower income off campus housing. Most people came to the conclusion that it's entirely possible that the goal was just to kill university students, and because it was a common area for university students to live, the killer wouldn't really know the difference between the victims who were and weren't enrolled. And an interesting cultural and political context at the time is that Florida had actually just sentenced Ted Bundy to death via electric chair, so people had faith that, like, yes, were this serial killer to be caught, justice would be served. Bundy and this killer had at least one commonality of both killing university students. However, the anxiety came from the question of, is this person going to be caught? And crime fighters and psychologists all were in agreement that the composition of these murders, the brutality of them, was definitely intended to strike fear. So a mass panic was exactly what this killer wanted. The press was constantly covering it. There were rumors circulating every hour, every day. The story of the decapitation element had been leaked, and so people were talking about that essentially nonstop, even though it hadn't been openly confirmed yet. But after the killings that happened on Monday, after Paulus and Tabata, the killings suddenly stopped, and investigators were confused. Because looking at the sequence of these murders, it seemed that it was going to continue, if not become a bigger problem, until this person was caught. So what changed? The Gainesville killer is what investigators like to call a marauder, because they operated in a very specific geographical area. Some marauders do that because they're really lazy, and they just commit their crimes close to home. Other people do it because they want to terrorize a specific community, and then some people do it to throw people off the trail, make them think that they have some sort of vested interest in that area when in reality it's kind of random. Then suddenly, after only a few days, the murders stopped. Why did they stop? Because the